All right, let me begin with the words that Rodney Needham gave me at the last time we met at the pub. We most of our meetings were at pubs in true Oxford fashion, and Needham, who had trained me to go out and wanted me to go out and find a particular kind, well, no, who knows, but I find to study marriage, a marriage system. The last word he said to me, he said, "Jim, when you go to field work, study everything," which is the opposite of what you would expect from a Needham student. He said, study everything. And it's the same thing that Cluckombe had said to me years before, and that has been my predilection to spread myself very thin and do as much on different topics as possible. I believe anthropology isn't one focus, but absolutely as many foci as the anthropologist chooses. All right. We go back 1965. We traveled, my wife and I. My wife has been with me on all stages of my work. And as I said, she's indispensable. Sometimes she's had to suffer a lot, but she's always been with me in the field, or for all the critical field work. My wife and I traveled to Indonesia. We arrived in January 1965. Now, I had an introduction to the then professor of anthropology at the University of Indonesia, Professor Kuncharaningrat, and I went to see him soon after I arrived, and he agreed to sponsor my research. I gave him my proposal, which was extreme Needham, and he looked at it and said, "You'll never get permission to do this. It's irrelevant to what we're interested in. Write a new proposal, short proposal, you saying you want to look at development on Rote." I wrote it, and in fact, I studied more on development than I did on marriage systems, but I did it, and he went to in a very difficult time, because it was extremely difficult to get a visa or get a permission. But through his assistance and the assistance of some others, I was given a diplomatic visa, which extended for over 2 years. It had the stamp of the foreign minister on it, and the signature of the foreign minister, or at least a stamp of the foreign minister. And when I arrived in Timor, no one had ever seen a stamp that important. So that was a very huge help. In fact, I couldn't have done my work without that support from Kuncharaningrat. But the situation in Indonesia was perilous. Sukarno was there. He was an amazing orator. To this day, I can still remember his oratory. And he declared he had an amanat, what would you call it, a kind of a statement to describe each year when he announced it. And this was Vivere Pericoloso, the year of living dangerously. And that was where Indonesia was at that time. And things were fraught. Inflation was running at about 20–30%. It went higher per day sometimes. Okay. So there are all sorts of stories of just about how you survived. I remember once we had to change money, and we had so many large bills. We had to get a trunk, and we bought toilet paper and put the money inside the toilet paper in order to disguise how much of this devaluing currency we were taking to Eastern Indonesia. And while I was buying that at one of the markets in Jakarta, a military man, he looked like he was, well, he probably wasn't a colonel yet. He came up to me and he said, "You're Russian." And I said, "I'm not. I'm American." "No, you're Russian." And finally, in this confrontation, I said, "All right." I said, "All right, if you say I'm Russian, I'm Russian." And he said, he looked at me right in the eyes. "I don't like Russians." And he walked away. You had this, Indonesia at that time was just always unexpected. And I took a boat. Well, first of all, I should explain that I was fortunate in being able to make contact with the Rotenese and the Savanese community in Jakarta within a few days. That was almost accidental, but I did. And they alone arranged everything for us. Even getting on the boat that took us to Timor, to Kupang in Timor, was dangerous. And so the Savanese police officer provided us an armed escort to have us when we got on the ship. This was really vivere pericoloso. And we were sailing into it. Leaving Jakarta when everyone else was going the other way. We were going in as a lot of people were leaving. So the trip from Jakarta to Kupang took 23 days. It was a long voyage with many, many stops. It was hard going at the time, but wonderful to see so many islands on the way. We began running out of food, so that every stop as we made, we'd buy food, extra food, in order to keep going. Arrived in Kupang. Again, I presented myself to the community in Rote, saying that I've come to study Rote, and welcomed. The Rotenese were then the dominant population in Kupang, and I had no problem in doing that. I made a special effort to show how politically stupid I was. Everywhere was plastered with banners of the PKI, which is the Parti Komunis Indonesia. And I made a point of telling people that I was so happy to see so many Christian signs up, Partai Christian Indonesia. And if you were that dumb about the political situation, you were of no interest, because everything was on a knife's edge. We were able to get on a small boat, my wife and I. She's had to suffer these same things, a tiny overcrowded boat, and we arrived on Rote. Again, I presented myself to the Chamat. At that time, Rote was one district called a Chamat, and a Kecamatan, and Rote was headed by a Chamat, and the Chamat was the Raja of Termanu. And I had intended, because the the blessing, all my life I've thought it was a blessing because back at the turn of the century, a Dutch linguist by the name of J.C.G. Jonker wrote and gathered texts on Rote. And he was professor of Old Javanese at Leiden, but he published mainly on Rote, which is what you could do at the time. And he published a grammar of Rotanese and a dictionary. And I remember in Leiden, Professor Teju said, well, Jim, you've got the Jonker dictionaries that none of us can understand. No one can understand them. You're going to have to start all over and study Rotanese from the ground up. In fact, if you've worked on Boas like I have, you can figure out Jonker. And when you figure out Jonker, you realize it is one of the most extraordinary dictionaries ever produced on any Austronesian language. It's 1 and 500, and the other's 800 pages of detail with no inclination as to what the overall structure is. But when you see it, you realize how well it's put together. And Jonker had focused on the domain of Tarmanu. Rote is a tiny island, but from the 17th century, it's been divided up into what I call domains. I've used that word, and it's pretty well stuck for all of Eastern Indonesia. These are little kerajaan, little units, political units, recognized by the Dutch, and the Dutch recognized 18 separate units on Rote. Each of these little units, in Rotanese, it's called a nusak. Each of these political units has existed for several hundred years, certainly from early on in the time of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. And each domain considers itself the center of Rote. And also they claim to speak their own language. So they would claim that any other domain around them is speaking a different language. In fact, Rote is a dialect chain. And in my studies, I have said that if you are to partition Rote, you have probably what are called dialects, but in fact, there are roughly 6 languages, 6 related languages if you go from east to west on the island, which means on Rote, anyone can understand the dialect on either side of them, but very few people can jump and understand the dialect at 2 removes. At 3 removes, it is a different language. But that's very important, as it turns out, and I'll talk about that when we talk about the role of ritual language, which was one of my interests. Anyway, the Chamat brought me to his residence in Tarmanu, and he had called all the clan heads. He introduced me to him and told everyone that I had come to Rote. He said something, he told me he didn't know what anthropology was, but he knew what history was, and he gave me the task of writing the history of Tarmanu, and that he could explain. So he formally announced that I had come to Rote, announced to all the clan heads that I was come as the historian. I was his historian and had to be treated as his historian. He then turned me over to his wakil, his assistant, and his assistant was to find me a place to live in Tarmanu. Now, at that first meeting, with all the clan heads, I did have just a hint of the clans of Termanu, which are it's embedded in one entry, one entry in Yonkers dictionary. And I had that list, and so I could appear to know a lot more than I did, because looking at that list, I asked in my then still insufficient broken Indonesian, I asked, who is from this clan? And I got a response. Who is from this clan? Finally, I came to the clan who is in Termanu is the head of the earth, the primordial settler of Termanu. There's always a head of earth in every domain. And this little old man stood up and introduced himself, and he was Menno. Now, Menno, who I call in all my writings, I call him Old Menno. His name was Stephanos Adolano. He was the head of the earth, and he was also probably from the 20s or late. He had always served as a kind of recorder of court proceedings for the Dutch. He didn't know any Dutch, but he had only had 3 years of schooling, but he had good Malay, very good Indonesian, and he was. We got to know each other. He was absolutely essential to all my field work. I went to him with all my questions. He told me, after a while, he was very upset. He couldn't sleep at night because he couldn't understand why I had come. And he hadn't come. But what I had brought was a very clunky, what was that time, an Uher tape recorder, a very clunky tape recorder. And I was able to tape things, tape conversations, tape ritual presentations. And no one on Rote had ever seen a tape recorder. It was too early. Later on, they knew it, but at that time, that was the first tape recorder ever to arrive on Rote. And they called it a penangkap suara in Indonesian, a voice catcher. And I had the voice catcher, and Menno said that now that he had several granddaughters, but his grandson was born while I was there, or certainly after I arrived. And he said, I want to pass my words to my grandson. And so he then really took me under. He was my language teacher. He was my informant, but I didn't live with him. He lived in one kampung, one village settlement. I lived in another with a man called Mias Kiuk, and he was the son of an important clan leader, and he was a clan leader of Ingu Beok, and he was the brother-in-law of the Wakil, who was serving the representative of the Chamat, or the Raja of Rote. So I ended up in the house that he had prepared, and it was empty. It turned out it was empty. He was preparing a house because his son was about to marry. And so I had the empty house. My wife and I moved in. So we had a house. We had Mias Kiuk as our landlord, and eventually he became my, quote, Rotanese father. So I was given a clan position in relation. I adopted his kin relations. So I then had sisters and all sorts of. I had relations, very clear relations within the community. Then so there was Old Menno, there was Mias Kiuk. And Mias Kiuk, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but I've made several films with Tim Ash. And Tim Ash is, Mias Kiuk is one of the speakers one of the dominant speakers at this thing. And I would urge you, if you have a chance, and if you don't, I can send you a disc with what I call the water of words. That's the title of the film, and there's a couple others, but Mios is very prominent. And what's interesting, and this it goes to the very heart of Rotenese culture. Rotenese never stop talking. Talking is everything for Rotenese. If you're not talking, if you're not arguing with someone, if you're not involved with someone, it has no, you're not a human. And their metaphor, one of many metaphors for this is that it's like a thick forest. A society is like a thick forest with the branches rubbing together. It's not just existing, but the rubbing. And you're always rubbing someone, not necessarily the wrong way, but you're always rubbing someone. So there's oratory, there's speak, and in a matter of weeks, I was being urged to get into a court case with someone. The Dutch claim that they did have court cases, and they said that they would drive any, and in fact, it may be true, not apocryphal, that they drove some of their Dutch administrators mad with their constant court cases. Nothing stopped. There's always dispute, argument, oratory, and that is the spice of life. Well, Mios, Hugh, the other aspect of it is, and this is somewhat I think it's very endearing, but Mios, the Rotenese also believe that they are the cleverest people on earth. There is no one, neither in Indonesia nor even in nowhere else in the world, as clever as they are. And Mios in this film has this marvelous line. He says, our brains are like gold. And you've got this intellectual, curiously, they are intellectuals. They are extraordinary intellectuals, and they've proved it. One of the things is that when the Dutch arrived and established relations, or the Dutch East India Company established relations with the Rotenese, they adopted Malay schooling very early. So hundreds of years before most every other population, they were running their own schools. They were running their own schools in Malay. At the time, they were adopting Christianity. They adopted Christianity. The rulers, not the ordinary people, but the rulers. Some of the rulers adopted Christianity and established Malay schools. And they had as many as a dozen schools already in the 18th century. Having adopted Christianity and Malay, they declared themselves equal to the Dutch. And they wanted to be treated, if you were Christian and spoke Malay, you were equal. They felt that they were on the same status as the Dutch. And they went through this process of addressing the Failsay, pretended that they had a ruler, a single ruler, not the governor general, the ruler. So the Rotenese wanted to send a letter to their ruler to tell them brotherly communications between the Rotenese and the king of Holland or whatever. Anyway, this is this gives you an idea of Rote. So from the very beginning, you, like it or not, you're thrown into this web of relations and talk. And one of the interesting, well, I'll just add a footnote to this, is what's interesting, you take the Rotenese population, it was about 75,000 people living on Rote and about another 14,000 Rotenese living on Timor, about at that time, about the 60s, okay? A tiny population. And yet, if you look at it, the first rector of the University of Indonesia, I mean, Indonesia's, millions and millions of people. The first rector of Indonesia was a Rotenese. The second rector of the second most important university in Java, Gajah Mada University, was also Rotenese. So they also had a track record because they had this very early schooling in Malay and in the Dutch system. They were very political at the time of the revolution. They were also very much involved in taking over the bureaucracy from the Dutch in Kupang. So they don't see themselves as a marginalized population. In fact, it's almost as if Rote, Indonesia, is defined in the radiation from Rote. And that's the kind of society I was involved in. Along the way, in fact, not along the way, I would say within a week or two of establishing myself. First of all, the Raja had said I could not pay for my accommodations. It was granted through his bequest, but I said I wanted to pay Jeremias Kiuk for my presence. And so we had this money in notes that were so large that they were devaluating so quickly. The faster I could get it out, the better. And so I paid the enormous sum for food and board on Rote per month, $15, calculated at the rate of $15. And I was able to pay that for 6 or 7 months in advance. That's when currency still had a value. And I gave it all to Mias. And what did he do with it? He immediately used it to buy all of the available lontar syrup in as far as he could get in Termano, a vast quantity of lontar syrup. Again, I explain for those people who don't know, Rote has an economy, and this is what I wrote about in one of my first book, Harvest of the Palm. Rote has an economy based around the utilization of the lontar palm. The lontar palm, the borassus palm, provides juice, it provides wood, it provides leaves, it provides all sorts of things. But most important for the Rotenese, it provides this syrup. And the Rotenese claim to have learned how to distill from the Dutch. I'm sure they learned from the Dutch. They've set up their own still. And Mias Kiuk set up a still behind his house, right next to my house. And we produced 11 bottles of gin a day. And that went on 7 days a week. And we could do that because Mias had cornered the market in syrup. And all of my rent had gone for this buying this. And we never sold a drop of that. And we never had a day where we didn't finish all 11 bottles on a day. So That was the water of words. The water of words produces a special kind of speech, and that speech is more often than not the ritual language that the Rotanese use to communicate all of their cultural ideas. And this culture, this I call it a ritual language. It is a canonical parallelism. I'll explain it as we go on. But this ritual language, whenever there is a question on Rotanese culture, it's always referred back in some way or other to ritual language. And time again, well, I began this man, another figure of importance, a poet named Peo Malesik came, and almost from day one, he wanted to recite for my Panankapswara, my voice catcher. And it was the first of one of many texts of recordings of ritual language segments. And then I went through a long process of trying to transcribe them. And once they were transcribed, I would take them more often than not to Old Menno to get his interpretation. And we would go through for hours and hours. So there was a certain schooling aspect, a formal aspect to this, because I had to record them, and I took every opportunity to record these compositions. Then I had to go through a long process of transcribing them. Often, as I got more fluent, I could transcribe them with the poet. And we'd sit with the poet, and the poet invariably would externalize the recording. So he would talk about the person in the recording as if it was a third person. And he would then say, well, this person said this. And sometimes he would say, this person said this, but he should have said this. And we'd correct the text so that we would get the right text. So I spent a lot of time working on these as one glimpse into Rotanese life, as I did all sorts of other work on Rote. But that gives you at least some idea of the Rotanese and field work on Rote. I'd end by saying that I spent, my problem on Rote was that malaria is rife, and when the coup came, the military were coming at one point to round up communists. I became very ill with my first case of malaria. And then once I'd had my first case of malaria, I'd have malaria almost every 2 or 3 weeks. So eventually, and it was very dangerous because I only got around Rote on horseback. And if you have a real bad malarial attack on horseback, it would be dangerous. So I'd eventually, in July or so of the following year, 66, we decided we'd have to return and make our way back to Oxford and to write the PhD. So that's a glimpse of Rote and life on Rote. So let's stop there.